Hi, this is Zim, and welcome to the fourth video tutorial on how to create custom music for Super Mario World ROM hacks. If you're brand new and need to get set up from the very beginning, start with the first tutorial. I've linked it in the description. In this video, we'll talk about using the built-in SMW instruments and how to modify them. We will not be talking about how to import external samples that are not from the original game, which is something you can do, but it's a topic for another day. As usual, we'll use this text editor, Notepad++, to write the music, add music, to convert the text into an SPC sound file, and SPC 700 to listen to the SPC. So how do you choose an instrument? I've got my Bach demo track here that I used in tutorial 1, and the basic process is very simple. Pick the instrument you want and indicate it with an @ symbol. All you need to know is the list of instruments and their numbers. I have a list here adapted from SMW Central. This is also linked in the description, but you can see all the various instruments and their @ numbers that you can use. So I'm going to choose instrument number 16. It's listed as a harp sound. It doesn't really sound like a harp, but it works as a decent default instrument. It sounds pretty good throughout a wide range. So I'll add it to each of these channels. Here it is in channel 0, and channel 1, and channel 2. Only using 3 channels for this particular song. I'll save it and let's listen to our harp version of the Bach demo. Great, and that'll start over again. Of course, you can pick any instrument you want to choose. Say I want a different channel to be this string sample, for example. I can just choose number 1. So I'll change channel 1 to a string sound. Again, it doesn't sound much like a string sound, but it's sort of an SMW equivalent. And of course, I can change samples partway through if I want. So if I want to switch this sort of baseline channel number 2 to slap bass and annoy the purists, I can throw in an @14 halfway through the channel, and it'll switch from that initial harp sound to the slap bass sound. Let's hear how this giant mess sounds. Here's the change. Believe it or not, slap bass is a terrible choice for that particular song, but you get the idea. Incidentally, if you don't indicate an instrument in a channel, it will default to instrument 0, which is sort of a fluty sound. And there's also a weird complication with percussion instruments that are numbers 20 and above these instruments here. But we'll talk about ways to get around that at the end. Now, one harsh truth you'll run into almost immediately is that a lot of these built-in instruments are of, let's say, variable quality. There's a reason, for example, that I haven't showed you the so-called piano sample so far in this demo. Ultimately, you're almost certainly going to want to bring in external samples. That said, it's still a good idea to learn how to use and manipulate the vanilla instruments. For one thing, you might surprise yourself and find uses for these samples you never expected. And even if you don't, a lot of the same things we talk about here will apply to external samples as well. So if you want to modify a sample, you use the instruments command. And here's the basic setup for it. We use the # instruments. Then you put a pair of curly brackets like this. And in between those curly brackets, you'll put the instruments that you want to modify. So you pick the instrument. You have to start with an existing instrument. You can't just create one from scratch. So I'll pick instrument 16. And next, what you need to do is put in the tuning values. This is a set of 5 values that each define a different aspect of the instrument. So to start with, you can enter the default values found in the instrument chart from before. So here are the defaults for instrument 16. Get rid of these commas. Do that. So these values are all in hexadecimal. We talked about hex in tutorial 2 if you need a refresher, or you can find an explanation somewhere online. Just know that hex values are numbers like any other numbers that just happen to be written in base 16 instead of the familiar base 10. For our purposes, you just need to know that the $sign does not mean anything except the following number is written in hex, and that all of these hex values, all 5 of them, are 2-digit hex values. So one final setup point. You can list as many instruments as you want here, and the way you indicate which you want in the channel is again with the @ symbol, just the same way you would use for unaltered samples. The first instrument in your list will be instrument number 30, so @ 30, and you'll go up by 1 for every instrument you list in the order you list them. You don't have to explicitly define the instrument as @30. That happens automatically. But it's handy to leave a comment, a silent comment for each instrument, so you can keep track of which instrument definition gets which at number. As always, you use a semicolon to leave a comment that doesn't affect the end result. So I'll do this, semicolon @30, and that'll just remind me that whatever changes I make to these values, I'll use @30 as my instrument, my altered instrument 16. Before we get into that, let's talk about what each of the 5 values does. So the first 2 values, what I've listed here as Y and Z, these determine what's known as the sound envelope. You can think of this as the shape of the note that the instrument plays. It's one of the principal factors that determines, that gives an instrument its characteristic sound. The sound envelope is defined by 4 parts or events that take place within each note, called attack, decay, sustain, and release. So you'll often hear the envelope called by the acronym ADSR. These 2 values, the double Y and the double Z here, are what we'll spend most of our time on here. The third value, which I list as double G, this sets the gain. It's essentially an instrument-specific volume level, though you can do a couple other things with it as well. I'm actually not going to talk about this setting today. It's complicated enough that I want to save it for its own video, but it does interact with the ADSR setting in some important ways, so I will mention it a few times. The last 2 values adjust the instrument's pitch, what I've listed as double P and double Q. And you can think of the first, that's the double P here, as a macro adjustment. It's basically a very blunt transposition setting. while the second, this double Q, is a micro adjustment where you nudge the instrument's intonation by a very small amount. But let's start with the ADSR, the sound envelope part of this feature. Before we start actually messing with the values, let's go into the Add Music README, specifically the hex command reference. This is something that you'll get automatically when you download Add Music. It'll be in a folder of READMEs. Very helpful document. At the bottom of the page, here, let me open it up. It is. At the bottom of the page, there's an interactive ADSR graph, which lets you visualize the changes you can make. Here it is. You can see the 4 parts of the envelope. Here's attack, decay, sustain, and release, and with all these possible settings for them. So attack is a time value. It's how quickly do you reach the note's maximum volume. The higher the value, the shorter the time, the faster you reach the max. So high values will start the note with a kind of da sound, while low values will start the note with more of a wah. And you can see it corresponds to this line on the graph. And these, if I change these values, if I do a very low value, you'll see that it's a much more gentle slope that the note starts with. If I do a high value, it's a much more steep slope, which means that we'll have that sort of immediate loud volume to the note. The second one is decay, this one here. And this is also a time value. It's how quickly does the note fade or decay from this maximum point, from the maximum point that the attack reaches. Again, the higher the value means the shorter the time, which means the faster the decay. So again, a low value is going to decay more slowly. You see the slope here is very gentle. High value is going to decay much more quickly. It'll come away from that top maximum value of the attack almost immediately. Sustain, this is the third one. Sustain is the only one of the 4 that is, it's not a time value, it's actually a volume setting. It sets the volume where the decay stops. So that's this point right here. The higher the value, the higher the volume. So there will be very little decay. So if I put sustain up all the way here, you'll see that there's basically no decay at all. And the lower I go on this sustain, the more decay you'll get, the longer this decay line will be until I get to these very low values and it decays a huge amount. Again, what we're changing is this sort of corner of the graph there. Finally, we have the release. And this is another time value. This determines how long it takes for the note to fade away. As with the other time values, a low value equals a long time, and a high value equals a short time. So a low value will keep the sustain. So if I set this to, say, infinity there, you'll notice there's no fade away at all. And as I make this value higher and higher, you'll notice that it's fading away more and more quickly, till the highest values fade away more or less immediately. So let's start with attack and decay, which are the first 2 parts. Together, these will determine how the note starts, and what musicians generally refer to as the articulation of the note. And attack and decay are determined by the first 2-digit hex value. So go back to our text file. That's this first 2-digit hex value here. There are 2 main complications that you need to be aware of. The first is that the decay value is actually the first digit. So here you see it, this F here, that is the decay. And the second value, again, here you see that as an E, That is the attack. So they're the reverse order of what you would expect. Decay first, attack second. The other complication is that for the attack value, again, that's the second digit, you have the full 16 options, everything from 0 to F. But for decay, again, that's the first digit, you only have 8 options from 8 to F. This is where gain, that's this third value here that I briefly referred to earlier, comes into play again. If you set the decay to a lower value, and if you set this digit to something between 0 and 7, Add Music will ignore any changes that you make to the ADSR and instead look to the gain value. In other words, setting the decay to 7 or less will render any of your changes to ADSR irrelevant. If you want your ADSR adjustments to matter at all, you have to set the decay to 8 or higher. So let's try some settings for the at 16 instrument that we're using here. And we'll just experiment a bit just so you can get a sense of how it works. So I'll bring back Add Music, and I'll bring back the SBC player. And so you see, these are both very high values, which means that for the attack digit, we'll get very quickly to its max volume. And that's what you want for a harp sound, right? A harp has a very sort of defined, pointed attack. So I'll just remind you, again, this is set to the instrument's defaults for instrument 16. So this will actually sound exactly like instrument 16 does, but just as proof of concept here, I'll actually change this to instrument 30 in our channels. Have to remember to get rid of this slap bass here. So right now, because I've set all the channels to instrument 30, it's looking to this line right here. So when we change this line, we'll hear the differences in the sound. But for now, let's just make sure everything is functioning appropriately. And this is the default harp sound, basically what we started with before. Right. So if I slow down the attack, if I bring this to a lower value, that first sort of point that you hear at the beginning of the note won't be quite so pronounced. So I'll bring it down just a little bit to start. Let's bring it down to say, let's bring it down to B, like this, and hear the difference. Again, not a huge difference, but just a little bit softer articulation. Let's bring it down a lot. Bring it down to, say, 6. Right. So that's definitely a wah sound that we're getting there. It doesn't even really sound like a harp anymore. It sounds almost sort of organ-ish. And as I say, you have a huge amount of, you can surprise yourself with the kinds of sounds you can come up with just by changing these values. So that's changing this attack value. I'm going to bring this back to E. And now let's slow down the decay. Here's a reminder of how this sounded originally. Oh, sorry, I didn't save. Broke my #1 rule. Save before you run. Right, so that's our original harp sound. Now let's slow down the decay. Again, this is the value that determines how quickly the note comes away from the attack. So the lower I make this value, the slower the note will come away from that attack, and it'll maintain a higher volume. Let's lower it just a bit to D. A very small difference, but you can hear that sort of right after the attack, the note is sustained, is held slightly louder than it was before. It's decaying more slowly. Let's bring it all the way down to, again, the lowest value you can put here is 8. Any lower, and it will ignore these changes and go looking for the gain. So this is the lowest possible decay value I can choose. Again, it's not a huge difference, but you hear that after the attack is happening, it sounds louder than it did before. It's not decaying quite so quickly. Now, if I do a low decay and a low attack value here, then I'm going to get a very mushy wah-wah kind of sound. Great. Now, as I say, you can't build your own instrument from scratch. You have to choose whichever built-in instrument you want to modify. Just as a demonstration, let's add a second instrument to this list. And let's add that string sample that we used before. So that's instrument number 1. And we need to go find the defaults. Here they are. And the instrument number 1 string defaults are these. Go back to the text file, and I'll add them in here. Get rid of these commas. And as I said before, every new instrument that you add between these brackets is going to go up 1 in terms of its instrument designation number, its @ number. So this will be instrument 31. Again, I don't have to type that in. That's an automatic thing that happens. It's just a reminder for me. And now if I want to use this string sound in its modifiable form that we have it up here, I'll go in and put instrument 31. And I've saved, so let's run it. Again, this will just sound like the default string instrument number 1 sample. Kind of a punchy little number there. And let's say that I want this to be maybe a little smoother or something like that, and I'm looking to these attack and decay numbers. I see that the attack is not so fast. It's A, sort of medium level, but this decay is very fast. So if I don't want it to punch quite so hard, I can bring this decay value down. Let's bring it down to A. And it'll be just a little bit more full. You won't get that huge sort of, well, decay after the initial attack. And let's say, you know what, that's still too much punch for me. I'm going to bring that attack value down as well. Let's bring it down to, let's say 6. Again, I can choose any value in between there to sort of tweak it to exactly where I want it to go. Okay, now let's go on to the next hex value, which determines the rest of the ADSR, the sustain and release, what you might call the body of the note, what happens after the articulation. Now, the good news is that unlike the attack and decay, sustain and release are in the right order. The first digit will tell you the sustain, and the second will tell you, more or less, the release. The bad news is that the 2 digits aren't completely independent of each other. Specifically, the release value can mean one of 2 things depending on the sustain value. It's actually not that hard to understand, but it can take a second to get it figured out initially. So how does it work? Well, let's go back to the README. And you'll notice that the sustain value has 8 options, while the release has a total of 32. Of course, you can't fit 32 values into a single hex digit, so you have to borrow, so to speak, some information from the first digit. So to get mathy, instead of thinking of these values as 2 hexadecimal values, you can think of them each as 4 binary values, 3 of which will be used for sustain and 5 of which will go towards the release. So what does that mean? Well, let's talk sustain first. Like decay, there are 8 possible sustain settings, each corresponding to a volume level. Unlike decay, however, you can set the sustain digit to any number between 0 and F. All 16 values are available to you. So 8 different volumes, but 16 different numbers to choose those 8 volumes. That means you can get each volume with 2 different consecutive numbers. So if you set the sustain digit to 0 or 1, you'll get the same sustain. If you set it to 2 or 3, you'll get the same sustain. 4 and 5 give you the same, and so on. 6 and 7, 8 and 9, A and B, C and D, E and F. Each pair of numbers gives you the same sustain level. Why do this? Well, remember, we have 32 different release values, 32 different lengths of time that the release can take. Again, if we're just using one digit, that only gives us 16 options. But if we have 2 numbers that correspond to each sustain level, then we can use each of our 16 release values twice. Once with the lower of the pair of the sustain values, and once with the higher of the pair of sustain values, giving us a total of 32 release options for each sustain option. So that may have been really confusing, I'm not sure, but I think it'll make sense when you see it in action. So let's go back to our text file, and let's go back to instrument 30. I'll change these 31s back to 30. Again, instrument 30 is the first instrument listed in our modifiable instruments bracket there. And I'll actually go back to the default decay and attack for this, which were F and E. And so right now, instrument 30 is the default setting for instrument 16 for the harp sound. So let's start by choosing the lowest possible sustain and release values and see how those work. Just a reminder, looking at the README here, that if I choose a very low sustain value, I will get a very low volume for the sustain level. I'll get a ton of decay, and the body of the note will be quiet, very soft. If I choose a low release volume, then the sustain the note will last a long time. In fact, the lowest value goes on forever. It'll go on until the note ends, so you won't actually get any fade away at all. So if I set, I go back to our sort of default harp sound here, which is the one we'll use, I'll set this to 0, 0. And again, 0 is the sustain value, the first 0 is the sustain value, the second 0 is the release value. And so the sustain will be very quiet, but it will last forever. So you hear after the articulation, you'll hear sort of pop for the articulation, because again, we have a very quick articulation here, FE. But the sustain, the body of the note, will be very quiet, but very long. Great. And so now I'm going to slowly bump the release value, the second digit, up little by little. Let's move it up to 0.8. This won't make a huge difference, but you might hear a little bit more fade at the end of each note. Again, almost identical. So let's bump it up again. Let's bump it up all the way to 0F. Now you'll really hear a difference. It's the same sustained volume. It's still decaying to that very low volume level, but the note is fading away much more quickly. There, you hear that. In fact, there's spaces between some of those longer notes now. Now, here's where the magic happens. We've gone from 0 to F for all these releases, but that's only 16 values, and we need 16 more for every sustained value. We need 16 more possible release values, 16 more options for that digit. So if we move up one, remember that 0 and 1 in the sustain are the same value. So that change from 0 to 1 for the sustain doesn't actually change the sustained value. It's still the same sustain. But now I have a whole new set of options for the second digit. I can go from 0 to F again with 1 in the sustained value, in the sustained value, and that'll give me the rest of my possible release options. So I was just at 0F. If I go to 1 0, this is going to give me the same sustained value. Again, 0 and 1 are the same for the sustain, but now I'm going to get even shorter notes. I'm going to get an even faster fade. And I can keep going up. I can go to 1 8. This will be quite short indeed. And let's go to the highest possible value for this particular sustain and release pair, which is 1F. And this is basically so short it'll barely register as a note. Great. So now here's the next kind of bump. So I've got all 32 of my release values there from 0, 0 to 1F. And again, those all have the same sustained value. The 0 and the 1 in the first digit here does not change the sustain. Those are all the same sustain, but 32 options with one sustain, 32 different releases. Now, when I go up to the next one, which is 2, 0, I've just changed the sustain value up. I've bumped it up one level, and now I'm starting over back at the beginning for the release level. So slightly louder sustain, and I'm back to the lowest possible release, this infinity value. So when you hear it now, what you'll hear is a slightly louder body of the note, and again, absolute sustain, no fade whatsoever. Make sure to save. And I can keep going through this process. Again, let's bump it up to 2F, for example. Again, I've just raised this to 16 values in the release setting, sustain exactly the same. And again, when I bump it up now to 3, 0, which is just one number higher, 2 and 3 have the same sustain. 1 and 0 have the same, 2 and 3 have the same, 4 and 5 have the same, and so on. So by bumping it up to 30, I have not changed the sustain. I've just gotten to the 17th possible value for release, this sort of second time through the digits from 0 to F. And so this will continue to make the notes shorter and shorter. And again, I can bump this up to 38. You'll get the same short notes that we got for 1 8 before. And if I bump it up to 3F, this will be very, very short. And that's it. That's the 30-second value for the 2, 3 sustain level. And so if I raise it any more, I go up to 4, and now I'm in the 4, 5 sustain level, and the whole process starts over again. So 4-0, slightly louder sustain, and it'll be absolutely long. There will be no release whatsoever. Note will sustain for as long as the note is. So again, one notch louder on the sustain and very, very long. Again, I can go through this process, go up to say 4F. This will shorten the note a bit. Or rather, it will have the note fade. And again, once I go up to 5-0, I'm still in the same sustain level. 4 and 5 have the same sustain. It'll just continue to make the notes fade away faster and faster. And again, this will go all the way up to 5F, which is the shortest possible note at this sustain level. There you go. So again, 0-1, same sustain, and you get 32 different values of release for that sustain value, that sustain level. 2 and 3 the same, 4 and 5 the same. One rule of thumb is that if the sustain value is an even number, you'll get longer values for your release. If the sustain value is an odd number, you'll get shorter values for your release. Now, I hope that was clear, but just in case it hasn't locked in completely yet, I made a helpful chart. This is linked in the description. And it's the second page here. Basically, it lists all the possible sustain and release values, every sort of pair of digits that you can put in there. And essentially puts it on a grid where if you move in one direction, it'll get louder or softer, and another direction will get shorter or longer. So you can see here 0-0, very soft, very long. 1F, very soft, very short. Double F, very loud, very short. And E0, very loud, very long. So if you're using, if you have a certain sustain release setup, and you know you want it to be, say, a shorter note, then you'll want to move this direction to the right on the chart. If you wanted it to be a softer note, then you'd want to move down on the chart. It's just an easy way to visualize what will happen when you make these changes to the values. So a quick review of what we've covered so far. The first two values in this # instruments hex command determines the instrument's sound envelope, the ADSR, the attack, decay, sustain, release. That is these two values there. With the first two-digit value being attack and decay. Again, decay comes first, attack is second. This second X value, this two-digit value, determines the sustain and the release. The first tells you the sustain with 8 possible sustain levels, with 2 possible numbers for each sustain level, 0 and 1 having the same sustain level, 2 and 3, all the way up to E and F. The release has 32 possible settings, and this is determined by the second digit, but we have to cycle through the 16 possible values twice. So the longest possible release will be 0 with an even number in the sustained digit, and as you increase this number, the releases will get shorter and shorter and shorter until you reach the shortest possible option, which is F in the second digit with an odd number in the sustained value. Before we leave ADSR, one final wrinkle. We've been setting ADSR in the instrument itself, but you can actually set ADSR on the channel level too, so you can put it down in this part of the code if you want. And that's the ED hex code. You can find that in the README that we've looked at before. But in this case, the ADSR will affect any instrument in the channel, not just a single instrument. Now, generally, the values and settings work exactly the same, but there is one important difference. Remember that with decay, you can only use half the values, 8 through F. Otherwise, the gain kicks in instead. But for the ED hex code, it's exactly the same, except the numbers are reversed. In other words, for the ED hex code, you have to set your decay to 7 or less for the ADSR to changes to work. And you need to use 8 or above to activate the gain. Again, exact same idea, but for the ED hex code, 0 to 7 gives you ADSR, 8 to F gives you gain. So it's each set of numbers reverses its sort of function in comparison to how they work with the instruments command. So I'll set aside the ADSR for the moment. And as I said before, I'm going to save gain, which is this third hex value, for another time. So let's go on to the fourth and fifth value, which change the pitch. And how do they work? So the fourth value, which I list here as double P, that changes the pitch by a large amount, shifting all the instruments all the notes that instrument plays up or down by the same amount, what musicians call transposition. However, this is a very blunt and limited transposition tool. You cannot, at least not with this value, transpose the instrument by any interval you want. You only have a limited set of choices, and they correspond to the first the notes of the harmonic series. So if you don't know what a harmonic series is, I won't go into too much detail. It's something that brass players know very well. But it's basically a set of pitches that all have proportional wavelengths. But again, with a quick demo, maybe this will be clear. So again, I have a chart here. This is linked in the description. And so if I write a G in the treble clef, all of these notes are Gs. The value, and if I choose one of these values, it will change that G to the second note listed here. So for many notes, if I have this value set at 3, that corresponds to reality, sort of what you see is what you hear, what musicians call concert pitch. It's the pitch of a piano. If I see this note and I play it on the piano, I will hear that same note. And if I go into the instrument's built-in samples thing and I look at that value, you'll see that a large number of them are 3s. Not all, but it's the most common one to use as your kind of concert pitch for a sample. So again, if I change this to any other value, that will change the transposition. Now, I've listed the first 7 here. These are the most commonly used. Theoretically, you can go up to double F. You have the full 2-digit hex range to use. But first of all, as it says here, 00 is silent. You won't hear anything. And once you get up past, certainly once you get to say 1 in the first digit, a lot of things can go really wrong. You'll get really high and get really high pitches. And most of the instruments just will, they won't work correctly. You won't get the right notes. So most of the time you'll use one of these values. But let's just see it in action. So right now, if I look at the default setting here, I'm going to change this back to its original form. Again, I'll use this harp sound. And this happens to be one where the default is 3. If I want this G that I've written here to sound like a G, I need this to be set at 3. And I'll just remind you of what this sounds like. Now, so if I set that value to 1, as you can see here, that's going to lower this pitch by an octave and a fifth. So suddenly everything that this instrument plays is going to be substantially lower than it was before. So let's hear it. It's set to 3. Now let's set it to 1. This is the lowest possible sounding value for this setting. Save. So let's run it. There you go. Much, much lower. And again, I can go through every one of these values. If I set it to 2, you'll see that that lowers it from a G to a C. So it actually ended up being an octave higher than the one we just heard, though still not all the way as high as our original value. But yeah, why don't we give it a listen? Here's how it sounds if I set this value to 2. There you go. Again, an octave higher than the one we just heard when we set it to 0, 1. Still not quite as high as the 0, 3 that we started with. Again, I can choose really anything I want to. I'll just do one more for demonstration purposes here. Let's set it to 0, 6. This one you do see sometimes because it's an octave higher than 0, 3. You'll see that if 0, 3 gives you the right note, 0, 6 gives you an octave higher than the right note. And so that's occasionally a sort of useful, sort of quick octave transposition you can use. But yeah, let's hear 0, 6. There you go. And again, I can keep going up and up all the way to double F. Most samples just can't handle those extremely high values, though. So you'll get, it'll sound weird. You'll get wrong notes and overflow, as they call it. So now, when would you use this? Honestly, not often, frankly, especially if you don't really completely understand exactly the harmonic series and what notes do what. This is sort of a dangerous setting. If you have all the right notes before you change it, you'll probably get all the wrong notes after you change it. So if you are going to change this, just make sure you really understand what notes you're transposing it to. But basically speaking, it'll take any instrument and make it substantially higher or lower than what you had before. There is one context where I do use this pretty frequently, and I'll talk about that later when we talk percussion. So next, let's talk about this fifth value. So the fourth value was a kind of a macro pitch change, again, transposition. The fifth value is a sort of micro pitch change. It's extremely precise, and it changes the pitch of the instrument by very small values. I'm going to bring up my chart again. It essentially tunes the instrument. It changes the instrument's intonation. And this value is measured by what we call cents. Cent being 1/100th of a whole step, 1/100th of the distance between C and D, for example. So yes, very precise. So here you have all 256 options available to you, again, from 0, 0 to double F. And if you do some math, you'll find that you can get more than a perfect fourth's worth of pitch change with a sort of complete range of this value if you want it. But again, just a quick demo of how this works. So I'm going to take this, I'll set this fourth value back to 03 where it started. And you'll see here that this fifth value is set to 0, 0. So there's no pitch adjustment happening for this first one. So if I move this a little bit, in fact, let's listen to it first to remind you what pitch level we're starting at. Right. So if I move this just a touch, let's move it up to say 0, 8. And this is 8 cents, 8/100ths of a whole step sharper than we just had it. And if you have good ears, you'll notice that that was just a touch higher than it was before. But again, I have a full perfect fourth's worth of leeway here, so I can make it really, really, really sharp if I want to. Going back to the chart, if I set it to 3, 2, that'll basically raise, not basically, it will exactly raise this by a half step. So suddenly all my G's will turn into A flats and all the other notes will move by that interval as well. And if I move this all the way up, again, I've listed a few other values, basically every value that gives you a new note. But yeah, if I move this up to double F, you'll notice that it's substantially higher than it was before. Great. So when would you use this value? Well, it's really helpful in particular with external samples. Not all of them are going to be tuned to the same level when you import them. And so if you have some samples which aren't tuned to the same level, you can use this value here to sort of nudge one of them in the right direction and get all your samples to the same pitch level. But again, to summarize, your fourth value for this instrument's function here is a macro transposition pitch change, one that will change the pitch level of the instrument by wide intervals. And your fifth value here is a micro pitch adjustment, one that will change it by very, very small sort of precision amounts. So finally, I mentioned before that there's a strange quirk regarding the percussion samples, particularly the samples from 21 to 29. So there's some percussion instruments that have lower numbers, but we're talking specifically about the instruments in the 20s. As you can see, there's this extra tuning value here. And what this means is that basically when you write a middle C, that's an octave 4 C, for one of these instruments, AddMusic adds a further pitch alteration. So 21 here, this instrument, if you write middle C, it'll actually turn it into octave 4 E. It'll actually raise the pitch just a touch. If you look here at, say, instrument 24, and you write middle C, it'll actually lower the pitch a little bit to octave 3A. Now, these are unpitched percussion instruments, so you don't actually hear the specific note, but at some point it was determined that making these samples slightly higher or lower gave them a better default sound. But there's an issue with how it works. In fact, it's fair to call it a bug. If you choose one of these samples and then write a bunch of notes in a row using that sample, the pitch change, this thing here, will only apply to the first note, and it will go away for all the notes after that. So the first note will sound the intended way, and the rest will sound different. So let's see this bug in action. I'm going to use instrument 29 here. This is sort of, as it says, power set. It's basically a fat snare drum sound. Here's my percussion demo track here. Not much to it, just 4 quarter note Cs. As I say, I've indicated octave 4. So again, this is middle C. And I've got instrument 29 listed there. And what you'll hear is that, again, this first note will sound like it's at one pitch level, while the third, fourth, and fifth, or sorry, the second, third, and fourth will sound like they're at a different pitch level. They'll lose that added transposition, which is supposed to be built into the instrument. Looks like it's saved, so let's run it. And it's looping over and over again because that's what SBC 700 does. So this can also cause a reverse problem. So say you don't want the default pitch setting. Maybe you want to change the octave, for example. So I could say I want this to be much higher. I don't like that pitch for the instrument. I'll change this to octave 5. This first note here, this first C, will still have the default tuning attached to it. You'll only get the note you want starting from the second, third, and fourth notes. So let's hear that in action. Right, so that first note that you hear, there's sort of nothing you can do about it. It's going to be that default tuning, and the rest will either lose that default tuning, which you may not want, or that's when any changes to the pitch that you add are going to kick in. So either way, that's not great, right? If you want the default tuning, you want it for every note. It won't give you that. It'll only do the first one the way you want. And if you don't want the default tuning, it'll always do that first note incorrectly, and you'll only get it from the second, third, and fourth note on. So let's talk a couple solutions here. if you do want the default tuning, one very effective, if inelegant solution is just simply to reiterate the instrument before every single note. Yeah, I'll change this back to 04, but it won't matter. As long as it's the first note after you've indicated the sample that you want, it will always use the default tuning. So if you always want the default tuning, this solution works just fine. There you go, same note every single time. Now that doesn't necessarily feel good to do it that way. It feels, again, just a little bit brute force. But we do have another way of doing it. And in particular, it has the added benefit of allowing you to make changes to the instrument too, instead of just always having the default sound. So I'm going to get rid of all these @29s here. And I'm going to use the same instruments functionality that we've been using before. So let's go find our settings for instrument 29. Here it is, instrument 29, and these are the hex values that I want. Put them up here. Again, if I want to, I can add a silent comment reminding me that this is instrument 30 now. And so I'm going to use instrument 30 like that. And now, since I have the defaults, I'll get rid of these commas. Now, what will happen when I do this is that this will actually remove permanently this transposition here, this added little bit of pitch change that the sample is supposed to have. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. If you want it, it's bad. If you don't want it, it's good. But what it allows you to do is have complete control. It won't give you one note for the first note and different notes for the second, third, and fourth. So you'll hear that all the notes sound the same. All of them don't have this little transposition attached to them. And now you have complete control over the pitch. So if I want to change this again to a higher octave, say 05, it'll work for every note instead of just after the first one. If I want the default setting, again, I can go and look in here, and I see that's an octave 3A. No problem at all. I'll just make sure that I'm playing an octave 3A. There you go. Now, the other advantage to doing this is, again, you have now access to all of these different values, these different hex values. And as I mentioned before, this is one of the few cases where I really use this fourth value, the kind of macro transposition one. Let's say I generally like what I have, but after mostly finishing the song, I've got a million notes written for this sample, for my snare sample here. And I just decided that overall, I think that snare sample is just a little too low. Well, I don't want to go through and change the note for every single one of them. So I can just go into here and I can raise it, transpose it up, say I just want to test it. Let's try it with 04 instead of 03. This is going to raise that instrument's pitch, make that drum a little shallower sounding without having to go into the channel and change every single note. And so let's hear the difference that makes. You know what, maybe I thought that was the wrong direction. Let's move it down to 02. And I can very easily try a bunch of different pitch levels without going into the channel and changing every note one at a time. Of course, being a percussion instrument, you don't have to worry so much about the what note you're transposing it to. Again, with pitched instruments, with violins and guitars, if you mess with this value a lot, you'll end up changing things to the wrong key. But as a pitch instrument, an unpitched instrument like snare drum, we don't tend to think of that as being in a certain key. So you can just use this value and not worry about whether it fits into the key of the song that you're writing. In any case, I hope that was all very helpful for you in terms of learning how to use and to modify the vanilla samples, the built-in instruments for Add Music and SMW. As always, thanks for watching and happy porting.